So next we got to look at criteria for selection for categorization. This sounds a bit strange, but what it means is this. There are roughly 85,000 species that have been assessed. And this is only a tiny number of the total organisms on the planet. Because categorizing a species under the criteria we've talked about before, so these criteria here, extinct, extinct in the wild, critically endangered, endangered, vulnerable, and the implications that has for funding and prioritization, it takes a lot of research. So we need to have a way of focusing our research as quickly as possible, some criteria for organisms to meet before we then go on to all the research needed for categorization. So the first one we're going to look at is species in habitats under particular threat. So these are habitats that are at risk of lots of habitat loss through farming or urban development or agriculture or something like that. And the species indicates wider health of the habitat. So the example is something like lemurs in Madagascar. The lemurs are a good sort of indicator species for the health of the wider community. So a decline in lemurs would be used to predict a decline in other species. We can also use criteria that they are evolutionary unique. So a species that is evolutionarily unique is because it has few closely related species. And we can call these edge species. So they are evolutionary distinct. Oh, that's right. Distinct and globally endangered. Okay, and this is our edge species. So by having few closely related species, they're typically the only surviving or one of very few surviving members of a genus, which is their evolutionary family. So things like pygmy hippos or the secretary bird, these are both distinct. So they're evolutionary distinct. They're quite different. There's nothing similar to them, but they are also globally endangered. So they don't have a very large range, or there are very few individuals left over a fragmented range or something like that. An alternative would be something like the aardvark, for example. It's quite evolutionary distinct, but it's not globally endangered, so that wouldn't be high on our priority list. Endemic species are ones that are restricted to a small area and they are found nowhere else. And if there's a change in that small area, then we are going to lose the entire population because there's no surviving populations anywhere else. These are typically found on oceanic islands, which are sort of biodiversity hotspots. So you've got places like the Galapagos, Seychelles, Hawaii, and Madagascar. And an example of this would be something like the Aldabra tortoise, which is a giant tortoise from the Seychelles. Next one then is a keystone species. So this has a disproportionate impact on an ecosystem for its biomass. So their loss will affect loads of other ecosystem services or functioning over and above like what you'd expect to see. So it's potentially a dominant species, but it doesn't have to be. Some examples include things like African forest elephants, these are seen as really important because they open paths in the jungle. So they allow different abiotic factors to be present and allow other organisms to move through the jungle. You have the fact that they disperse seeds because they do not rechew the food, and they eat it whole and they deposit it in useful places with some fertilizer. And they keep water holes open by digging, which benefit other species as well. And other examples are things like wolves and beavers. Next one then is our flagship species. So these are the species that have a high public profile. So they might be quite attractive or charismatic or interesting, and they encourage the general public to support protection. And this might be just because they look nice. And they typically have quite a big impact on an ecosystem, but normally the idea is then that they are protecting this one species will protect all the other species that live in the similar ecosystem, and we sometimes call that an umbrella species. So its protection will help protect everything beneath it as well. So things like giant pandas, tigers, orangutans, are all important, but you do get other species, spiders, bats, fungi, or moths, which are just as ecologically important, but would not attract the same level of support. And the last one then is degree of population dispersal. So if we have a global population that's fragmented into isolated populations, each one is vulnerable to local disasters. They might be low on resources or have a low genetic variation within the population because it's too small. And all of this will result in the population being more vulnerable to extinction than one population that is well connected. Additionally, if we find all like the entire population is just in a centralized location, so it's not spread out, it's all found in one country in one mountainous area or something like that, then it's going to be vulnerable to local changes to conservation success. So if you have a civil war in that country, if you have an economic decline, climate change, all these things would affect that one area and you would lose that population and therefore the entire global population because it's only found in one place. And the example for this are things like bonobos, which are a type of sort of large apes or similar to chimpanzees. They are found in one country, whereas chimpanzees are found in many countries. And the issue then is whether these populations are large enough or they're too fragmented or something like that.